Hello, welcome. Thank you for clicking on this video. My name is Anne and I am the proprietor of Fiddle Lane, and today we are going to do a May book recap. So in my monthly book recap, what I do is I talk about all the books that I read, give a little summary, and then give my thoughts, a rating, pros and cons, that kind of thing. So that is what we are going to do today for the May books that I read. So the first book that I read was The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. This book I give 4 stars to, and I have to say I was really teetering between like 3.5 to 4 stars for this book. And I'll explain why, but let me give you a little summary first. So essentially, the Rabbit Hutch is a term for this like apartment building in this sort of Midwestern town, and all of these people that live in this apartment building, we sort of get a glimpse into their lives, and it's sort of a story with a lot of different subplots about the people who live in this apartment building. The book focuses on like 3 main characters. So we have Blandine. She is a foster youth who's kind of growing up, and she is experiencing life and like the purpose of life and what it means to, you know, grow up essentially. We also have, I think Joan is her name. She is a resident of the Rabbit Hutch, and she is a woman who is very meek, keeps to herself, those kinds of things. And then we also have Moses, who is the son of a famous author, and we sort of follow him and his journey and what brings him to eventually the Rabbit Hutch. My pros for this book are, first and foremost, it was beautifully written. I think it's very clear. This is Gunty's debut novel, and it's very clear that she has a passion for writing. Her diction, the way she wrote was beautiful. It was very rich. It was very descriptive. It was really a beautiful novel to read. The other thing that I really liked about this novel was that Gunty used the language that she wrote as a way to convey the innermost thoughts of the characters. So she didn't have to say what the characters were thinking. She used a lot of metaphors and similes and this very descriptive language that really helped you understand the innermost thoughts of the characters. So in terms of cons, I struggled with this book because essentially it's a book about nothing. So the main storyline, the overarching storyline, is with Blandine and what sort of happens to her at the beginning of the book. Something's happening to her essentially, and so we sort of backtrack a little bit to figure out how we came to the position that we're in. That being said, there's a lot of like subplots that happen with obviously all of the residents of the Rabbit Hutch. So there's like an older couple, there's a mom and dad who just had a baby. There's like a couple of different people woven into the storyline. On top of that, there are a lot of chapters that really have no point in them, I guess I would say. So like one of them is like a dialogue on the page of an obituary for somebody, and I love this in that I love the way that Gunty writes. I think that it's so funny seeing the way that she describes these different people who were writing on this obituary, but like that wasn't really necessary for the progress of the novel. It's a pretty big book, I would say, and I think that a lot of the book is just sort of here, there, and everywhere. The other thing I would say is that the dialogue itself, on one hand, it was really descriptive and beautiful. On the other hand, though, it was almost too rich. So I actually read an article about the book and a book review from someone else, and she had said that she felt like Gunty's writing was like a really rich like dinner. And I think that is just like the perfect description, because it's almost like the food is so delicious, but it's too much sometimes. Like you have to put your fork down at a point and be like, this is too much, I can't handle this anymore. And that's how I would describe, I think that's the perfect way to describe Gunty's writing, is that sometimes it was too much. There was one particular scene where Blandine is delivering a dialogue in this person's car towards the end of the novel, and it was almost comical because these were not things that anybody would say in real life, and they might be thoughts that somebody would have, but the way that she wrote, it was like a monologue, as though Blandine was actually delivering this speech, and the reality of it is, like, that's not a thing. That's not a thing that would happen. Nobody would speak like that. The other thing, and this is probably just a little bit of a nitpicky thing from me. I really did not like Blandine. I think that her character, you start out the novel really feeling sorry for her, and as her life progresses, you know, you kind of realize that her life in and of itself isn't that bad. So she, you know, you think that she's been through all of this abuse and her childhood was really bad, and while there's parts of it that you don't know as the reader, I think the parts that we are given by Gunty really make me dislike Blandine in the way that she reacts to the world. I think that everybody has this unknown path when it comes to growing up and determining who you are, what your values are, what you like. I feel like Blandine really was very childish about this whole thing. The way that her story comes to pass, a lot of it is self-inflicted by her actions. And in that way, it makes me not really sympathize with her because she's laying in the bed that she's made. I really did like Gunty's writing style, and I would be interested in reading more of her work. I think this book is definitely worth the read, but it's more of a journey that you go on rather than a destination. The next book I read was River Sing Me Home by Eleanor Shearer. This book gets 5 stars, hands down. This book was a beautiful book. It was written very beautifully, and the premise on which it was written was also really impactful as well. So River Sing Me Home is a book about a slave who is supposedly freed, but really what happens when they abolish slavery, this is down in, I think it's Cuba, they really the slaves end up becoming essentially indentured servants. So they are apprentices now. They are no longer slaves. However, they cannot leave. They are essentially owned by the masters of the plantations. It's essentially a glorified term for slave. So Rachel is her name. She runs away from her plantation, and her journey is to find the children that have been stolen from her. So obviously, as a plantation worker and a slave, whenever she had a child, they were taken from her, obviously for, you know, to sell, to use in the house, but essentially she never was given the joy and the pleasure of raising her children and maintaining a family relationship with her children because they were all taken from her. So she goes on this journey across, you know, the sea and the land and all the places to find her children. I have a lot of pros. I think this book in general was just really a beautiful piece. It's an interesting glimpse into history that we maybe are not taught, we maybe do not know. So Eleanor Shearer, she leans on her family history and her experiences, and a lot of that comes through in this book. I think the book is really eye-opening, and it's very raw. And in that way, I think it's really a beautiful read. I also really liked the character Rachel. At times she was frustrating. At times I felt like she was a little bit meek, and I wanted to be like, go get him, Rachel, like have the courage. But really what it comes down to is that she was a woman on a mission. She was a mother trying to find her children, and she went through so many things, very self-sacrificing, to find out what happened to her children and to try and reconnect with them. I also really liked Nobody. I thought he was a great character. I think you often come across characters like that, and they always turn out bad. They always turn out, you know, just to be selfish or in it for their own reasons. And I think the relationship that Nobody builds with, I won't say who, but I think that relationship is really beautiful. I don't really have any cons for this book. I thought it was a great book. I did listen to the audiobook version of this book, and it was a beautiful performance. I think there were occasional times where it was just a little bit slow, but they were almost the respites between the more action-packed scenes. The next book I read was One of Us is Dead by Geneva Rose. So this book gets 3 stars. A quick synopsis of the book: we have a salon owner, her name is Jenny. She caters to some really wealthy upper class women. They come into her salon, get all the kinds of things done, and at that same time she is really party to a lot of the gossip in the community and things like that that are happening. We have Jenny and then this cast of characters. Shannon is just been divorced from her husband, and her husband recently married a new gal named Crystal. Crystal comes in and is trying to be part of society as well, but of course Shannon really dislikes her because She feels like Crystal dethroned her. We also have Olivia, who is really just bitter and awful and an absolute terrible human being, mean to everyone. We have Karen, I think was her name, and she ends up struggling a little bit in her marriage, possibly trying to explore her sexuality a little bit. And then of course we have the husbands of the wives and the roles that they play in society. So essentially this story follows along a couple of weeks or months, kind of looking at the dynamic of these characters, and it concludes with the twist that one of them is dead, obviously, hence the title. And so basically throughout the storyline we are trying to guess, number one, who died, and number two, what happened. So in terms of prose, I think this was a fun storyline. I think that the way that things panned out were interesting. I thought it was a fun idea. There was a lot of things going on, a lot of kind of guessing what happened here, what happened here. There's death threats throughout the book, so you're kind of trying to figure out who's the one that dies, and it's sort of a guessing game. I think the plot in itself was interesting, entertaining, and fun. For cons, I struggled with the writing of this book a little bit. The writing felt very like puerile, however you say that. It just felt a little bit childish at times. It didn't seem very complex. I think the most complex of the writing was when we focused on the brands that the women were wearing, you know, a Gucci top and blah, 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 this type of shoe and whatever. And I think that that's interesting, but at the same time, I feel like the storyline itself needed sort of more of a deeper writing style, and I think it could have been a lot more serious. I also think that there was just so much detail on the drama, and I understand that that's kind of where the author was going, placing a lot of detail on the drama between these women, that it was almost too much. It was very immature drama, and so that when you kind of find out what ends up happening, it's actually a very serious sort of situation. And I think there was so much emphasis on this drama between the women that what happens at the end isn't really given enough pages. The conclusion, the things that happens with the video and those kinds of things, I feel like that could have really been expanded a lot more, and I think it would have made the novel more engaging. Overall, I think this book was okay. It was like a fun read. I think I would look at the author and her other works if I was looking for something easy to read, fun, you know, not too deep, possibly sort of a beach read. The next book I read was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This book gets 5 stars. I was really impressed with it. I thought it was a great read. I had heard a lot of things about this book, of course, but I really was not prepared for what this book was. So a quick synopsis, we have a very famous person, her name is Evelyn Hugo, and she contacts this reporter to sort of write a biography about her. And through this, we learn the history of Evelyn Hugo and her time in show business, and obviously her 7 husbands and different kinds of things like that. This book overall, I think, was more of a commentary on what it means to be a woman, and unfortunately some of the choices and actions that women must make to be successful in a patriarchal society. I think that there's a lot of truth in this idea that women often have to resort to certain actions and measures to be taken seriously. So in terms of prose, I just think there were a lot of prose. I think overall, since this book was very much a commentary on society, I thought that a lot of the prose were very real glimpses into some of the following issues. So number one, of course, being a woman, what that means in the patriarchy. Number two, the author really challenged the norm of what we see when it comes to love. So how we understand love. We often see love, I think, in a very one-sided way. I think we often see love in a very like romantic way. And we assume that, you know, your soulmate or whatever is a romantic partner. And the author sort of challenges this with a friendship, a completely platonic friendship. And I think that's an interesting take on what we see as true love. The author also challenges the way that we view intimacy and intimacy versus like physicalness with a partner. So I think that oftentimes we view being physical with somebody as a form of intimacy. And while that can be true, she really describes how intimacy is not necessarily anything physical. Rather, it's the way that you share things with somebody. It's the way that you open up with somebody, and that can be far more intimate than any sort of physical interaction with someone. I also think that she comments on this idea that we all have demons inside of us, we all have baggage. Everybody makes choices and everybody makes decisions, and oftentimes we in the moment think that those decisions are best, but perhaps retrospectively they weren't the best decision. However, were we to go back, we may make that exact same decision. So I think it's an interesting sort of juxtaposition in terms of like what we view as good versus what we view as bad, and basically are the lines so clear cut. I think the pacing was great in this book. I think I finished this book in like a day or so. It was really good. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great read. As such, I don't really have any cons for this book. I think it was really good, and I would definitely recommend reading this book if you haven't already. All right, the next one we're gonna cover is The Bride Wore White by Amanda Quick. So this book is sort of it's in a series called the Burning Cove series. It's also sort of a historical romance mystery is I think the category of this book. I picked this book up off the library shelf. I had no idea who this author was or anything. I hadn't read anything from this series before. So this book I gave 2.5 stars. So a quick synopsis of this book is we have this gal, her name is Prudence or Madame Ariadne, and she's like sort of like a fortune teller, dream weaver, you know, sort of lady. So she has these paranormal abilities to dive into other people's dreams essentially. So the book starts, she has a man in her like reading room and she can tell that he wants to kill her. Later on, we end up kind of following her and she meets a guy named Jack, and they kind of figure out this story. We end up finding that there's a sort of a plot possibly against Prudence, against her, some people that she had been associated with, the Dover family, and there's murders, there's a fire, and we're trying to essentially figure out what's going on and who, it's sort of a whodunit. So my pros for this book was that overall it was a fun story. I thought everything with the Dover family is essentially this super rich family. They have all this sway, they own the Dover Industries. There's also, of course, some paranormal elements involved in this book, which I always like a paranormal like little twist on it. I also think the book itself was engaging and it was well paced. It was a relatively quick read, it wasn't a long book, and I think it kept me engaged pretty much the whole time. In particular, I really liked the opening, how we opened with Madame Ariadne and in her shop there and all sort of the things that happened with the opening. That being said, I really struggled with this book in terms of like the way that it was written, the language. The language was very simplistic. It was at times almost I felt childish, especially the dialogue between Prudence and Jack. It was like cringeworthy sometimes when I was reading the dialogue between them. I get that the author was trying to add this sort of like, you know, sort of like sexual charge or like romantic intrigue in their like banter, but it almost was just like annoying, I think. And that really, I really struggled with that. There was certain parts of the book that I just like was embarrassed to be reading it because of the language that was used and the way that it was written, and that was just so distracting for me from the actual plot line. So I think that the way the book was written just interfered with the story, which sucks because the story itself I think was fun. I think this book really had potential to be built out even more. I think we could have gotten really serious with this book, but as it was, it took sort of a comic approach, particularly the paranormal part. And I just think that really took away from the overall book. I would possibly read more books by this author. Amanda Quick is actually a pseudonym. So the author itself has like a lot of different books. I was reading, she has probably like, you know, 20, 30 different books, different series, etc. So I might read another book of hers and just see if maybe I like it a little bit better, because again, I did like the plot line, but it was just the writing that interfered with the story. All right, the last book I read in May was The Voyage of the Dog Trotter by C.S. Lewis. So I have been slowly working my way through the Chronicles of Narnia. I read the full series once when I was a child, but I've been listening to them again on Audible. They're just super entertaining. I really like them. They're obviously children's books, but I think a lot of what he writes is pertinent to adults, and in general the stories are engaging and fun. This book gets 4 stars, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a C.S. Lewis book under 4 stars in my opinion, because I really like him as a writer. I think he writes in a very entertaining way, in a very like realistic way as well, which is something that I think is hard to achieve when you're writing fantasy. This book in particular, The Voyage of the Dog Trotter. The Dog Trotter is of course a ship, and they are with Prince Caspian. It's Lucy and Edmund and their cousin Eustace, and they are traveling, they're sailing to the Lonely Islands, which are sort of off the beaten path on the corners of the map, and they're essentially exploring the islands and trying to find some like friends of Caspian. So in particular, I really like the way that C.S. Lewis writes, because I think that he has this somehow ability to convey emotions in a very adult way. So the things that he conveys, they seem childish almost, right? Our narrators, our characters, we can see that the story is from a child's point of view. However, he'll often talk about things like, he'll say something like, so-and-so snapped because they were tired, as one often does when they're tired. Like, the way that he describes these like feelings that everybody feels. He describes these thoughts that everybody has, not just children. And so in a way, he almost like validates the human existence, which that sounds like pretty intense for a children's story, but that's really what he does. Like, he describes this story, he builds this beautiful, fantastic world, and then he relates it back to emotions and thoughts and feelings that we all have. So it feels very real, and it feels very sincere. I also really love Eustace. I wish that Eustace had kind of a longer period of being like grumpy and like crinkly and like all the things, because Grumpy Eustace is literally my favorite person. Like, I think he's got a very dry, the way he's written is very dry, and I just think it's great. I think he is fabulous. I think he is hilarious. I love the juxtaposition between like him and Edmund, and you can feel Edmund like writhing from the things that Eustace says, and my god, I just think Eustace is like a 5-star character. I don't really have any cons for this book. I think going into it, if you read this book, you know it's a children's book. It's not going to be like a particular, a particularly difficult read or anything like that, but I think it's entertaining. I also think, since I did listen to this on Audible, so I have the entire Chronicles of Narnia series on Audible, and each book is a different narrator, which is really fun. And I've enjoyed each narrator as I read through the books. I think it was fun to listen to. It's a fun read. It's easy to listen to, and it's just a fun way to pass the time. All right, well, that's all the books I read in May. So those are my reviews. Those are my thoughts. If you have read any of these books, or if you're looking to read any of them, or if you have differing opinions than mine, I would love to hear it. Drop it below in the comments. I'd love to start a dialogue. In terms of like the books that I read, I do have a couple of like books that are on my to be read list, but oftentimes I just browse in the library and I find a book that I think is interesting. So if you have any recommendations for me, definitely leave those below in the comments as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you are a reader like me, welcome, Readers Unite. If you did enjoy this video, consider subscribing. I would love to have you. And otherwise, I will see you in my next video. So have a great week, y'all, and I'll see you next time.